Hello everyone and welcome to this Open Networks Flexibility Consultation webinar. We've got a packed schedule today, so we'll get started in just a couple of minutes. Just wanted to take you through our usual housekeeping slides before we get started. So as usual, we'll be recording this webinar, and if you have any questions at all, do feel free to put them in the chat, or during the scheduled Q&A sections, you can raise your hand if you'd prefer. As always, we are here to answer any questions after the webinar as well, so you can email us at the usual address, which is on your screen. Welcome to everyone who's just joined this webinar. We will be going through our flexibility consultation. We've got lots of product leads who'll be giving you overviews, and we will get started in just 1 minute. Okay, Annie, would you mind moving to the agenda? And Simon, I will hand over to you as chair.
Great, thank you very much, Emily, and a warm welcome. It's really pleasing to see so many people joining us for this, the first webinar about our flexibility consultation. As you can see from the agenda, we've got an action-packed couple of hours. We've got some great topics and fantastic speakers. And as you can see, we've split the agenda into two halves. We're going to cover flexibility services and then have a Q&A session. And then we're going to pick up flexible connections and non-DSO services, again, followed by a Q&A session. It's really pleasing to introduce this webinar because of the huge amount of work that the ENA Open Networks project has done. It gives us an opportunity to talk through the work that we're doing, and a fantastic opportunity for all of our stakeholders to actually see the progress that we're making and provide some feedback on what we've done to date, and at the same time help us shape what we are planning to do in the future. So I ask to strap yourselves in, because it's going to be an action-packed afternoon. There's going to be lots of detail provided to you guys, and there will be opportunity all the way through to add comments into the chat function. We will quickly go through the presentations one by one. Please add any comments, any questions in, and then when we get to the question and answer session, that we will then go through and bring the panel back together and answer all of your questions. Well, hopefully answer all of your questions, but if we are unable to answer the questions in the 20 minutes, then we will write comments, we will write responses, and get them back out to you sometime in the next 5 days or so. So without further ado, let's go to the first speaker, Helen Sorden, who's going to pick up product 2 on procurement processes. So I'll hand directly over to you, Helen.
Hi, yes, thank you. So I'm not the product lead actually for product 2. I sit in the product 2 group. Our product lead, Steve, is on holiday, so just covering for him. But yeah, I'll give you an overview of the work that we've been doing this year and the work we're looking to get your feedback on. So the key objective of P2 this year was to try and look at what alignment we could achieve between ESO timescales for procurement and D&O timescales for procurement, and look at the reasons that the possibility of alignment, and if there were reasons that we couldn't align, what those reasons were. So we have written a paper that confirms implementation timelines for proposals for alignment across the ESO and D&O timescales. And that proposal from that paper really concluded that, that the feedback that we've received in terms of aligning market procurement timelines between D&O and ESO was inconclusive. Feedback was mixed. Some stakeholders would prefer quite clear alignment. Some stakeholders would prefer the more staggered approach. Most feedback, was around visibility and being able to get visibility of those timescales rather than an aligned approach to the timescales. And we also recognise that as DNOs do start to move closer to real-time procurement, which is currently being trialled through some of the innovation projects, the TEF being one of those. So as we move closer to real-time procurement for DNO services, that will naturally bring us closer to alignment with the ESO. So we are aware that there is a drive for alignment across the two D&O and ESO procurement timescales, and we are seeking feedback from the sort of analysis that we've produced in this paper and our conclusions in this paper around those sort of timescales, whether they be standardised or staggered. And we have also identified opportunities that we can improve some of the coordination and visibility of upcoming flexibility procurement, both within the D&O and ESO market. So for that, we're looking to enhance the ENA website to give a better overview of the timescales and the timings and timeframes related to D&O ESO procurement. And we're hoping to do that through the existing precedent system that the ENA already has in place, that already does signpost some of the procurement that's underway through D&O activities, and the link for that is there. So next slide, please. So the questions we're really asking for feedback on in this consultation is, do you agree with the P2 product team's findings regarding the alignment of D&O ESO timescales, and can you provide us with any sort of rationale or supporting evidence that we can use to better inform our approach, either now or in the long term? How do you think we can further evolve the alignment of procurement processes in the future? And also, do you agree that the proposed improvements that we're hoping to put in place in terms of visibility across the ENA website will be of benefit to your sector, to the industry? And again, yeah, if you can share some of the rationale and information that we can use to inform our improvements that we make in the future. I think that's it, actually, isn't it? That's my last slide on this one. Short but sweet.
Great, thank you very much, Helen. That's a really good set of questions out there first off for people to respond to. So I'll hand over now to Matt, who is going to talk us through product 5 around prime receivables. So over to you, Matt.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. Good afternoon, everybody. So my name's Matt Rivet, and I am the Regional Development Programmes Delivery Manager for the ESO. So I'm co-leading Product 5 with Matt Watson from WPD. So we've got a few slides to take you through here, which sort of talks about a bit of an overview of primacy and the sort of description of what we're working towards. And then we've got sort of a key question at the end, which we'd like you to think about. We very much welcome your feedback. So the first slide is just really what we've kind of come up with as the description of primacy for those that aren't too familiar with it. We are obviously aware it's quite a hot topic within the industry at the moment, and we understand it's going to be quite a big and meaty product to move through the next few months. So what is it? Well, conflict between one or more services, effectively between the ESO and DNOs. What that could result in is potentially inefficiencies on the electricity system as a whole. So what we're trying to do is look at ways to manage these service conflicts and optimize the system both efficiently and transparently. We'll be looking to develop sort of rules and principles that enable these services to be dispatched and influenced by their sort of whole system value. And probably most importantly, we want this sort of product and the rules and principles that are developed to be very clear and transparent with the whole industry. We understand this is quite a complex area, so we're keen to sort of get the ball rolling quite quickly on overall sort of stakeholder engagement, which is part of the reason for the presentation today. So we can move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So here we've just pulled out for your sort of benefit, really, an overview of the main product aims. So we're going to be basing some of our initial work on the work that was developed under previous open networks products, and the idea behind product 5 this year is really to start to develop those sets of principles and the rules associated with those principles so that we can look at means and ways of implementing those between now and sort of the start of ED2 in sort of April 2023. And some of the key things that we're hoping that the rules will look to take into account are things like local networks, sort of physical technical requirements, the sort of risks to overall operability of the whole system, both from a sort of transmission and distribution perspective, the ultimate value to flexibility service providers, and the ability to help facilitate market and also the sort of price-driven actions that we're increasingly seeing across the system today. And then finally, the needs of the emerging market-based platform developers, and finally the end consumer. So it's going to be a sort of an iterative process in terms of how we look at developing the rules and principles and the scenarios that they could apply to across transmission and distribution, taking into account these sort of factors that we've listed on the bottom of this slide. So move on to the next slide, please. So this slide covers off some of the work that we've already started within the product team. So we actually did kick this product off slightly earlier because of the sort of volume of work and deliverables associated with primacy. And we've already started to pull together a project reading list and already carried out some evaluation of some of these projects in relation to input that they could have into the overall primacy product. So I won't go through all the projects that you can see there on the table, but it gives you an example of some of the areas that we've already looked into, how they could actually influence the primacy products, and ultimately how some of them might be influenced by the output of primacy as well. So we're really trying to cast a broad net on this as much as we can. We've had some discussions with international projects already as well, which in some cases are a little bit more developed in the primacy space, but we're very much interested in making sure we've got any relevant projects captured early on in the product so that can help set the foundations for the development of the rules and principles. So we move on to the final slide in relation to primacy, and this is the killer question really that we're looking to get input from yourselves on. So we're interested in any projects or pieces of work that have considered primacy specifically, and the areas that we're most interested in finding more information about are the brief overview of the project, what it was trying to deliver, the areas within that project that were specific to primacy, where it considered potential conflicts of services between either transmission and distribution or between parties within the particular project that was being considered. Crucially, any recommendations on the development of principles or rules, scenarios and use cases as a result of the project work. And finally, any sort of outcomes of actually any testing that went on as a result of that project. So I know that some of the innovation work to date has started to look at different kind of war games and scenarios of where primacy would be useful to help make decisions on sort of network services. So this will really help us to get off to a strong start and will inform the sort of next phase of the product, which is really to start the derivation and development of the overarching principles and primacy rules, which will then be socialized for sort of further input and comment as the project develops or the product develops. So that was it from me on product 5. Really would value your input into this area so that we can get off to a strong start. So thanks very much. Back to you, Simon.
Great, thanks very much, Matt. So okay, next slide, please. So we're welcoming Helen back, and she's going to talk to us about product 7, which is the baselining methodology. So back to you, Helen.
Hi, thanks, Simon. Yeah, so I'm product lead for P7 Common Baseline Methodologies, and this product is a continuation of the work that we did in 2020. So in 2020, we sought to assess existing UK and international baseline methodologies. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel when it came to UK baseline methodologies. We wanted to look at existing practice both in the UK and overseas. And following the assessment that we did and consultation with stakeholders at the time, the 2020 project recommended a suite of suitable methodologies that could be adopted by the UK distribution flexibility market. So in 2021, our product objectives have been to look at implementing the common baseline methodologies so they can be adopted by all UK DNOs, carry out some further consultation with stakeholders around the 2020 baseline recommendations so that we could finalise the baseline design that we would take forward for implementation. And we also produced an implementation plan of how we would sort of the timeline of how we would implement these common baseline methodologies, and an ongoing governance plan around the sort of standardisation or the development of baseline methodologies moving forward. So very much recognising that what we're doing now in these early stages is taking a simplistic and accessible as possible approach to allow us to adopt common baselines and reduce barriers as much as possible for participation and flexibility, but recognising that there are innovation projects underway that are also looking at baseline methodologies, especially when it comes to emerging technologies that we've had little experience with to date. So we have got sort of a framework that we've put in place to make sure that we continue to develop and feed into baseline methodology design. Additionally, one of the objectives this year was to build a baseline verification tool. So this is going to use the calculations from the recommended baseline methodologies and produce a sort of accessible online tool that people, DNOs and both potential service providers, any stakeholders can use to allow them to upload data and produce a baseline calculation. If you want to go to the next slide, please. So the end of July, we published an interim report just to conclude our findings from further stakeholder engagement that we'd done this year through 2021. And our conclusion that we've stipulated in the report is that we're not going to deviate from the 2020 recommendations that were produced through the work last year. We have considered some feedback that we've had around technology inclusion. As I mentioned earlier, there are some concerns for emerging technologies and how they would particularly be able to participate if they were to use an historic baseline, and some existing technologies, if they're intermittent and they don't necessarily have reliable historic data. Again, there were concerns around that sort of technology inclusion, but the recommendations from 2020 did identify an alternative nomination baseline that is suitable for other technologies to be able to use where historic data isn't going to be reliable enough. But we did recognise, obviously, as I mentioned before, as DNO experience does increase over time, we wanted to make sure there's a structure in place through open governance to make sure that we develop more appropriate, more accurate methodologies as that sort of learning comes to us through experience, through innovation projects and through stakeholder feedback as well. Also included in that report is the details around those open governance arrangements, so what the framework for that will look like. We've included detail on the planned delivery of the baseline verification tool, and we've also included a sort of an easily interpretable table of the final baseline design. And there is a roadmap included in there as well, which outlines the ongoing activities for the P17 this year, what that DNO implementation timeline looks like, and the ongoing governance timeline as well. So I think if we go to the next slide, that is that's the roadmap. So detailed in there, we've got the activities this year through the product team and the delivery of that verification tool by the end of this year. And then from next year, we'll move into the open governance framework as DNOs begin to implement the common baseline methodology. And there's also sort of a framework in there to make sure that recommendations for changes to baseline design or changes to the baseline tooling is fed in through the open governance group back into DNO, so that we can do any change implementation if necessary. So next slide, please. So the question that we've asked, or we've posed in the consultation, and that we'd really like feedback on is the roadmap that we've outlined for the delivery and for the development of aligned baseline methodologies for the management of distribution constraints. Does that meet the needs of the current market? So that's the points I've drawn out there is that we've looked to implement a simple and accessible baseline solution now in the early stages, and we're providing tooling through the baseline verification tool, and we'll also be publishing the details of the calculations for each of the baselines as well. So we've got a very transparent and accessible approach. And then we've also got that framework in place for the ongoing development as well for baselines. So yeah, we'd really just like some feedback around that sort of timeline, that plan that we have in place to make sure that we can get that commonality now in the early stages and try and get it as simple and as accessible as possible, but make sure we've got that framework in place, as I said, to develop it moving forward. So I think that's it from me. So thank you. I'll hand back to you, Simon.
Great. Thank you very much, Helen and Matt. Really good set of presentations, lots of information and some very, very thought-provoking information and some really good questions as well. So before I hand over to Emily and Avi, who are going to manage the Q&A session, it's worth me just gathering Matt and Helen together, and I think the three of us are going to sit on a panel and take all the questions. So over to you, Emily and Avi.
We haven't received any questions yet, so we are openly inviting people to either raise their hands if you would like to ask directly, or to share anything in the chat. We'll give it a couple of minutes, and if not, we can move on to the next section, but do feel free to put any questions in the chat and we can always come back to them with Helen and Simon. Everyone's being a bit shy today. Or we just gave them enough information to take away. Okay, well, we can move on to the next section.
Okay, great. Thank you, Emily. So let me welcome Fiona, who is going to pick up product 3. And this is the principles to review legacy A&M contracts. So Fiona, over to you.
Thanks, Simon. So I'm actually part of the E&A team, but obviously I think quite a number of you know me from a previous life at Centrica when I was on the other side of the table. So today I want to talk about the Workstream 1A's product 3, which set off at the start of this as a product that was going to look at the principles that we might use if we were to review legacy flexible connection contracts. So just a little bit of background to that. There was a product in last year, which was product 5, which was looking at trying to look at flexible connections on A&M schemes and how they work with flexibility services. And as a result of that work and actions that came out of that, a number of A&M flexible connection A&M products were developed for this year, and we're going to hear a couple of the others after this. But product 3 really came out because there was a general recognition that these contracts are set at the time of connection, and at that point the level of curtailment risk is also fixed. And there was a view that obviously as time moves on, the value that customers have in terms of their network access and what they can do with that access and the degree in which they get constrained might change over time. And obviously the networks are also evolving, and of course we've seen growth in demand as well as generation. So, you know, the net needs of the networks are changing over time. And there was a perception or a concern that, you know, the curtailment requirements and the windows that are determined at the time of connection may need changing over time. And also that some customers may feel that they want to get out of these contracts and exit them to go on to a more firm contract. And at the time, there was quite a lot of I guess, customer feedback that there was no formal process for doing this, and concern that there was no option for reviewing what was set potentially a few years ago. And, you know, if in the future their business cases changed, there was no way of getting out of these contracts, that they were there forever. So that's what the issue was, and that's what this product set out to try and look at. And so obviously, if people want to exit these contracts, how would you go about reviewing them? I'm just going to add that there are a number of interdependent products on this, because as everyone knows, flexible connections and A&M cover the broad spectrum, and some of the issues are interrelated. So I know Harriet and Sven are on the call and they're going to talk about their products, but it's worth mentioning that part of the issues with these connection contracts is about provision of curtailment information, and that's an activity within product 9 that we are dovetailing with. And they're also looking at, it's not just about curtailment information at the point of connection and understanding the risk, it's also what happens to that curtailment information once the asset is operational. So obviously you can see that has a direct link to the concern that I just mentioned, where people were saying, well, things change over time and my risk might change over time. So there's a big interdependency and a lot of coordination that we do with product 9. And similarly, product 8 is also looking at how can you apportion risk better and provide more certainty about flexible connections. So again, there are interactions with that product, and just to reassure you, we work together as a sort of an overarching product, and we are avoiding duplication and making sure that these things are taken into account. And the final point was for this particular product was we really needed to focus on low regret activity. Ofgem, obviously at the time, hadn't opined on or provided a minded to decision. We obviously have that now, but we were conscious that whatever the final decision is on that SCR, it could have quite a material impact on the choices or the need or even the attractiveness of flexible connections. So everything we've done has tried to be low regret in the event that, you know, regardless of Ofgem's decision, that we don't find ourselves with wasted effort and wasted resources. Could I have the next slide, please? So in terms of what we've done to date, so one of the first actions when trying to understand these contracts was to sample contracts from all the DNOs and to look at their different approaches and how they format the contracts, what's included in the contracts. By contracts, I mean the flexible connections facilitated through A&M. And we captured all that information, and we were also looking for insights. You know, where are the variances, and why do some DNOs do things differently, and are they better? Do some DNOs have, you know, some activity that would be helpful more broadly? So we did a complete drains up on the contracts that are already in place for these connections, and then we engaged a fairly focused stakeholder group to have a look at the findings and get a lot more feedback on what we'd found and what was important to them and what we should include, and that actually informed the final report. So the report came out was not just about the contracts, but it also reflected what we'd heard from that focus group. And to be clear, what was very helpful about that focus group was the majority of people actually have these contracts and have experience of running assets with them or are currently going through the process. So it was really good to have that sort of feedback from customers that are, you know, experiencing the pros and cons of these types of contracts. So there were a number of conclusions that came out of that report, and these are, I guess, are the key ones. So as a result of that work, so we went into the work believing that there was an issue with exiting these contracts, and, you know, we did a lot of activity trying to understand what the options were, and came to a conclusion which we shared with the stakeholders that actually, if somebody wants to exit from an existing flexible connection contract, that is possible today. And it's through the standard modification request to your DNO, known as a G99 form. It's that process often, depending on your DNO, has DNO surgeries. So, you know, there is a way of getting out of these contracts if that's what you'd like to do, or, you know, we would advise that, first of all, speak to your DNO, attend one of these surgeries, talk about what you're trying to achieve, and then go down the formal route for a request. The second headline that came out was we were looking at standardisation, because we know that's an issue for stakeholders. And what we found was that most of these contracts tend to be fairly standard. Most are using a standard contract, and the A&M details behind the scheme are contained in some kind of an appendix or contained within the connection agreement. So not perfect, but quite a high degree of standardisation there. And the third issue that we looked at was, you know, what are the technical commercial arrangements? And again, we concluded that at a high level, the arrangements and the requirements for flexible connections are quite similar. That said, what we did recognise that the A&M schemes are provided by different technologies and different providers. So often, if there are differences, it's not the principles that vary; it's more the technical issues or the engineering that goes in on those particular A&M schemes that means things are slightly different. And finally, curtailment information. This is where we did find there was quite a lot of variance across each DNO, again, largely due to modelling and charging differences, and also, as I said, depending on the technology that have been applied to deliver the A&M. So although the core principles are the same, there is quite a lot of variance between curtailment information and also ongoing curtailment information. So post-connection, once operational, the information that's provided and or annual reviews also vary quite a lot by DNO. So on those activities, they are primarily, obviously, as I said, we're working with product 9, which is curtailment information, and they will obviously start to take on board that information and will build it into their plans. So if I just go to the next slide, please, Annie. So in terms of next steps in this area, one of the big things that came out was, given that we believe there's an exit strategy for these contracts, then there is obviously a need to signpost better to the customer that this option exists and be more proactive in how it might be accommodated. The second step that we identified was that, do we need to look at, is it a low regrets opportunity to look at the benefits of a common flexible A&M agreement for legacy contracts, given that they're quite similar, or at the moment we're considering whether, given we now do have an SCR decision, whether the benefit will be in looking forward and looking at how future agreements might look, and developing a common agreement for the future rather than looking backwards. But this was one of the actions to look at what are the needs and benefits of a common connection for the existing contracts. And the third action then is as I said, we were looking at where there were variances in approaches across the DNOs, and we identified a couple of different options that different DNOs did, which we felt might be of interest to stakeholders. So one was a 2-stage connection offer, where a firm connection was going to be possible, but not immediately. So a contract would be offered, and it would have 2 stages. So there would be a predefined section up front that was a flexible connection to accommodate the connection ahead of the reinforcements, and it was clear then what the second stage would be in terms of the firm connection. So that obviously, especially with the SCR decision, now starts to look quite interesting, because we can see that there might be cases where projects are ready to go, but they're waiting for reinforcement works to be completed or for tenders to go out for flexibility services. So 2-stage connection offers, or having a planned interruptible capacity approach, could be features that are of interest, and so they're explored in a little bit more detail. And finally, there was a question about, when it came to this curtailment information, whether DNOs should be offering potentially an additional service, but one where a lot more granular, view of curtailment risk and the sensitivities with that curtailment, and whether that should be provided by the DNOs, or whether there was an opportunity here to explore provision through a third-party routes. And again, because that's all about curtailment information and delivery of curtailment information, that is actually being delivered by product 9. So just to conclude, the questions that we've put into this particular consultation is, we obviously run these questions, the issue of an exit route with stakeholders in this smaller focus group. We're just interested to hear from wider stakeholders. Do you agree that there is an exit route, and that using the G99 approach? And if you don't agree, then what do you see is the barrier to being able to exit these contracts? And more generically, then the second question is really, given the things we've pulled out in product 3 and the areas that we're looking at, do you agree that these are the right places to be looking now? And I guess, even since this was produced, we've had the SCR decision, so we're looking at how some of these actually could be quite important to deliver Ofgem's minded to approach. So do you agree with what the area of work that we're doing at, and which areas do you think are of most interest going forward? And that really concludes the area on product 3.
Brilliant, Fiona. Great summary of the review work you've done, and some really open questions for our stakeholders to give us their views and help shape some of the things that we're doing in the future. So thank you very much. That's brilliant. I'm now going to hand over to Sven, who is going to give us a bit more detail about product 8, and arguably in the same area as Fiona, but looking at apportioning curtailment risk. So over to you, Sven.
Just quickly, Simon, before we hand over to Sven, we had a question in the chat in relation to flexible connections off of the back of Fiona's presentation, which might be worth covering now, perhaps.
Can do. Yeah, you're thinking about issuing that to Fiona.
Or, or whoever would be comfortable to answer it.
Okay, so we'll ask the panel to get ready, and do you want to read out the question then, Emily?
Yeah. So have there been any examples of customers exiting flexible connections? Presumably there is a fairly hefty cost.
So are we doing that now, sorry, or at the Q&A?
Yeah, we're going to do that now, Fiona.
Okay, so off the top of my head, Matt, I don't know if there are any examples of customers exiting with a flexible connection. The fact that the view was that there wasn't an exit strategy prior to this work suggests that there hasn't been any to date, because people didn't know it was possible. And in terms of the exit strategy, it would be so if you wanted to exit, you would apply the G99, and it's the usual. I don't know the cost off the top of my head, but there is a cost associated with making an application for a connection agreement, just as there is on the transmission systems and the DNO systems. So the costs involved would be the standard request for a connection. Obviously, if as a result of that connection request, a firm connection had reinforcement costs, then those costs would have to be paid as part of as they are now if you want a firm connection. But it's possible that if you think that your area has got less congested now than it was when you first applied, you might find those reinforcement costs are lower than they were when you first took out a contract, and in which case it might be of interest. I guess my hesitation on some of this is the minded to decision from Ofgem on the Access SCR. And it might be one for the Q&A session later, is I'd be interested to know if customers with these types of connections would now apply to go firm, or whether they'll just wait till 2023, when, if the minded to decision becomes the decision, the reinforcement costs, or a large proportion of those reinforcement costs, will disappear. So if I was an asset owner now, I would probably be waiting to see what happens to that minded to decision, and whether I'll just wait till 2023 and apply then. And I guess that goes back to what I said earlier, that this SCR decision does have a material impact on this particular product, and trying to understand where we should be focusing our efforts, and where perhaps we should be looking forward, making an assumption that that minded to decision will become the final decision, and how best to go forward with these types of contracts on that basis. So are there a long answers, sorry, Matt, to your question?
I think Matt might like to add something else.
Yeah, sorry, if that's all right, Emily. Just a quick hypothetical, I guess, in that you could have signed up to a flexibility contract and paid the lower connection costs, and in the meantime, the DNO could have reinforced the area on the basis of gradual demand increase, or gradual generation increase, and therefore there is now spare capacity. Does that then, I guess the question is that then fair if you then exit the flexible connection and go onto a firm connection? You've kind of dodged the cost, it would appear to me, but that's a question for the group as a whole, I guess.
So does any of the panel want to step forward, or shall I have a go at trying to answer Matt's question? Okay, it's down to me then. So I wouldn't assume, Matt, that the cost of the reinforcement or the proportional cost of the reinforcement wouldn't come the way of the customer. If we've reinforced the network and we have allocated some previous costs to some other customers for that reinforcement, then there is a hangover for recovering those costs to the users who take up the capacity for that reinforcement. So,
but if you are reinforcing just on general demand increase, that then gets factored into DIOS, doesn't it?
It does do, yes, yeah. So I think you're right in principle. You just need to be mindful of how it is applied and how the trigger is.
Yeah. Okay, just an interesting thought, I think.
But you would, if you have, you know, as Fiona said, if you believe your network has become less congested because the host DNO has reinforced or things have happened that you're aware of on that network, then obviously the first thing to do is go back and talk to the DNO and start those discussions.
Okay, thanks.
We have another connected question from Joe Colebrook. If someone applies to go to a firm connection, would customers higher up the LIFO get first refusal?
I guess my first question is, what do we mean by would they get first refusal for what?
I guess I can jump in it. I guess similar to what Matt was just saying there, if there's a reason, if there's a reinforcement isn't required anymore for the firm connection, is it fair that someone lower down the LIFO gets that firm connection?
So just taking it one step at a time. So if a customer thinks that they would like, for whatever reason, for their business model, they would be better off on a firm connection, they can apply for a firm connection. That firm connection may still have reinforcement costs. It doesn't mean that there aren't any. It just may mean that the reinforcement costs now are less than what they were previously, or less relevant because the business case has changed. So if a customer wants to go firm and wants to pay the reinforcement costs associated with that connection, then they can do that, just as anybody in that LIFO stack can do that. So there's no doesn't matter where you are in that stack, anybody can apply for that connection. Now, as Simon said, if there's been reinforcement recently, I think I'm going to get a little bit out of my depth now because I don't have a background in DNO, so I'm sure Simon will retrieve me if I go off piste. But there are a thing called second comer charges. So if somebody else ahead of that, if the network's been reinforced because somebody else previously has paid for that reinforcement and somebody else then comes along and says, actually, I want to go firm, they won't necessarily get it for nothing, piggybacking that other generator. There are a thing called second comer charges, so they would have to pay part of those charges. And the customers in the LIFO stack, if they want to apply to go firm, they can go firm just as easily. So I don't think there's any issue about first refusal. It just depends on what the customer wants to do.
Yeah, that makes sense.
What I would say though is each case, I wouldn't say is unique, but each case was bound to have some different aspects. So the first port of call really is the host DNO. Talk to them.
The other thing to bear in mind is if somebody has come along and triggered something and paid for some reinforcements, it's quite possible that everybody in that LIFO stack is benefiting from that anyway. The issue there, of course, though, is that benefit can go away if somebody else comes and connects with a firm connection. But as Simon said, I think the first thing to do is talk to your DNO or attend one of their surgeries and get better informed on what the options are in that particular location.
Okay, any more questions or related questions, Emily? No. Right.
We've got one
So-
question that we'll cover in the general Q&A section. So good to move on.
Okay, brilliant. Excellent. So come back to Sven, who's going to give us opening curtailment risk. So over to you, Sven.
Thank you, Simon, and good afternoon, everyone. I'll just do that. So just a brief recap and overview of what we're all about within P8. In a nutshell, customers with flexible connection contracts, strictly speaking, the contract doesn't inherently have any kind of maximum or minimum level of curtailment that the customer can experience. So in theory, at least, the risk of curtailment is unlimited. And this obviously does present potentially a bit of a problem and certainly a challenge. So the idea behind the P8 product is to see if we can suggest a mechanism by which the risks can be bracketed to a certain extent to give customers a bit more certainty. The first proposal, quite straightforward, I guess, is to potentially provide customers with a curtailment cap. So when they sign their connection agreement under flexible terms, they are given a maximum amount of curtailment that they will experience, with the DNO picking up effectively the cost of having to do reinforcement in order to get over the curtailment that goes over that cap. Now, that curtailment could go high for a number of reasons, but the main reason that might result in changes over time is things like background load growth, or more specifically, background demand growth. So depending on the type of constraint, if you're a generator and you're sat behind an export constraint, it might be that the take up of micro generation exceeds, or the take up of energy efficiency measures, for example, might exceed the take up of increased demand due to things like heat pumps and electric vehicles. So it could be that over time your generator constraint becomes worse. In effect, then, what's happening is that a generator on a flexible contract ends up covering a cost of reinforcement that would otherwise have been paid for out of socialized costs through the normal load-related reinforcement mechanism. So the idea behind the cap is to set an upper threshold that once curtailment has gone beyond that, the DNO treats that as a signal for conventional reinforcement. When I say conventional, sorry, for load-related reinforcement, just in the same way as background load growth occurs. And important to note that in this context, when we talk about load-related reinforcement, we are including flexibility service procurement as well as traditional asset builds. So that's one half of the proposal. In order to bracket risk at the other end and to help distribute benefits and risk more equitably along a LIFO stack, we're also proposing a collar. So this is curtailment instructions that can be issued by A&M systems outside of the normal LIFO mechanism, just in order to manage cap breaches whilst the required reinforcement is implemented, so to cover that time period. So to help explain all that, I always like a picture. So what we have here is an illustration of how the cap and collar system would work. What you've got as you move from left to right is increases in curtailment over time, with the LIFO stack order being customer A first off, customer E last off. The green area on that diagram is an illustration of the collar zone, if you like, of curtailment, and the orange area is the cap zone, with the blue area in the middle being the sort of expected level of curtailment plus or minus some sort of a margin. So as of day one, what we're illustrating there is that the customer A, who's usually first off on the queue, will probably experience the most curtailment compared to customer E. As time progresses, as curtailment becomes more frequent and more severe due to background load changes, Customer A is the one who will bear the brunt of that in terms of consequences. Customer E may even be completely unaffected. It all depends on the extent and the frequency of the constraints and how the A&M systems operate. Ultimately, in this diagram, we've got customer A who breaches a cap. That then triggers a load-related reinforcement activity from the DNO. And as you look down that LIFO stack, we've got two customers, D and E, who have had curtailment levels so low that they're actually below this collar level. And therefore, what the A&M system would be able to do is to effectively take those collar levels and move them up the LIFO stack to before customer A. So as curtailment is required in this post-cap breach time period, it's actually customer D's collar would get targeted first, then customer E's collar, and then back to customer A, B, C, D as normal. So in terms of benefits of this approach, the key one, obviously, with the cap is that customers have an upper limit on their curtailment risk. The use of the cap as a trigger for load-related reinforcement, it provides a funding mechanism, partly for the transferred risk towards the DNO, but it also helps fund investment in networks where that reinforcement really is needed, so where congestion is highest. And again, just to reiterate, flexibility service procurement is included as part of reinforcement options, just as we would consider them for any other conventionally triggered load-related reinforcement. The collar mechanism is there really just to share risk more equitably among the customers that are benefiting, both from the initial avoidance of reinforcement costs, which is their benefit of signing up for a flexible contract in the first place, and then also from the subsequent works that are funded by Duos customers, but mainly benefiting the flexible connection contractees in the LIFO stack. And that, in a nutshell, is what we're proposing for P8. And we welcome any feedback or comments on those proposals. Thank you for your attention.
Great. Thanks, Sven. And diagrams are brilliant. Explain easily what it is that you're proposing. So thank you very much. We're now going to move over to Harriet, who is going to talk us through product 9, which is about the work with our stakeholders to understand what curtailment information that they would like. So Harriet,
Simon,
over to you.
Sorry, before we move on to product 9, can I just ask a quick clarification question as Sven?
Yep. Do you want to fire away?
Yeah, sorry, can you bring back the pictures? Right, so Sven, if I'm right in thinking, so the curtailment of customer A that is loaded onto customer A first until they hit the cap, and then it goes on to customer B. But or does everybody have to get up to the collar first before you start increasing customer A again? I'm a little confused about when the collar kicks in. Does the collar not?
Okay. Yeah. So the collar, if you like, is it represents underused curtailment. So some customers have barely been curtailed, but they have signed up to flexible connection contracts that, you know, where they should really expect some level of curtailment. So the breach of customer A's cap is what triggers load-related reinforcement. That reinforcement will then benefit everyone in the stack to a certain extent. And so in order to just help out, just to alleviate further consequences on customer A, you know, further increasing curtailment well beyond their cap. In effect, what this proposal does is borrow spare curtailment that is unused by potentially some customers, not definitely. So the collar level would have to be, and as with the cap level, there'd have to be some careful thought given as to exactly how these levels were set. But in that illustration there, obviously that customer A breaching the cap triggers load-related reinforcement, but it takes time in order to either place flexibility contracts or to carry out asset builds to alleviate the constraint and bring curtailment levels back down again. So to cover that period and to reduce the risk on customer A, the proposal is, as I say, to effectively go to customers D and E first when the A&M system needs to curtail up until they've used up their collar values.
Sure. So you're not talking about customers D and E needing to get up to their collar values whilst A is below the cap. A will keep on taking the curtailment risk until it hits the cap,
Yes.
and then anybody who's below the collar will fill the gap until the reinforcement or flexibility scheme has been put into place.
Yes, they'll fill the gap as far as the their available collars will allow. Yes,
okay.
Yes, that's right.
Okay, thanks for that. Sorry,
no worries.
Brilliant. No, thanks, Matt. And bear in mind, it's an illustration and we're looking for views. So if you've got any ideas about how it should work differently or anything, the guys would really love to have any feedback that you've got regarding that. So please give us your answers on those questions. So, but I'll hand over now to Harriet. Over to you, Harriet.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Harriet. I'm a power systems engineer in UK Power Networks, and I'm the product lead for product 9, which is all about improving curtailment information. So what we've been doing, our focus is to work with stakeholders to identify the principles and key data requirements to deliver improvements in the provision of curtailment information between now and the end of ED1. So in terms of benefits, the main benefits that we see are improvements in the availability and frequency of both curtailment and network information to increase opportunities for both firm and non-firm assets to provide or stack flexibility services, which will ultimately reduce system costs for the end consumer. It also facilitates liquid flexibility markets and accommodates the anticipated growth in low carbon asset connections. It also can promote best practice approaches across DNOs and improves the viability of the flexible connection product for stakeholders. So the scope of the product is the first step was to review the existing DNO approaches to providing curtailment information. After having done that, then the next step was to gather stakeholder feedback on the priorities and key data requirements for improving curtailment information. Once we've gathered that feedback, then the next step was to complete a gap analysis to compare existing DNO curtailment information in comparison to what stakeholders are telling us are their priorities and data needs, and then ultimately work with stakeholders to develop a prioritised implementation plan for delivering improvements between now and the end of ED1. Let's just go to the next slide, please. So this is just a little bit of a timeline in terms of progress to date. So as I mentioned, our first steps were to capture what DNOs are currently doing in terms of providing curtailment information, and then work with stakeholders. Initially, we sent out a questionnaire to quite a wide group of stakeholders, capturing information on curtailment needs from the whole customer journey through pre-application to offer stage and post-energization. We then held a stakeholder focus group based on responses from the questionnaire about who wanted to be involved in the focus group. We had a workshop on looking at some of the initial responses that we got from the questionnaire and kind of doing a deeper dive into what priorities and specific data needs were coming through from stakeholders and flexible connection customers. So that culminated in a report that's been published on the ENA website in I think it was June. The next step for our product group then was to complete a gap analysis. So each DNO looked at each of the specific priorities and data requirements that were coming through from stakeholders, and we have completed a gap analysis on what we are currently providing in comparison to what stakeholders are looking for, and getting a view on what looks to be priority, and what looks to be how feasible are these to implement as DNOs between now and the end of ED1. So I mentioned there that we are working quite closely with a focus group, and we do plan to pick up again another workshop with the focus group in early to mid September, where we're going to go through the results of our gap analysis with stakeholders, make sure that we're all kind of on the same page and agree where the gaps are and where the priorities are, and that will help us inform our implementation plan for actually delivering these curtailment information improvements between now and the end of ED1. So one of the consultation questions that we wanted to capture today was, obviously I was mentioning that we've been using a stakeholder focus group to help us identify specific curtailment information needs and priorities. And if you agree with the approach that we're taking in working closely with that focus group, or if you have any other suggestions about how we can capture stakeholder requirements. So if you just go to the next slide. So this is a little note on some of the outcomes to date based on our stakeholder feedback from the questionnaire and the workshops. The following principles and data needs we've captured as priorities for stakeholders. If you want to look at this in more detail about everything that we've captured, there is that report that I mentioned that we published in June, and maybe we can provide a link to that later on if you're interested. But at a more high level, some of the key priorities that were coming out were around the transparency on the nature of constraints and modelling assumptions, information on commercial alternatives, increased granularity and accuracy of network data, access to historical half-hourly power flow data from network loads and generators, more regular updates of heat map data, consistent information provision across DNOs was coming through a lot for each stage of the connection journey, as well as faster response times and enhanced availability and accessibility of curtailment events through something like an online portal. So another consultation question that we wanted to get a feel for was, so far, if you believe that we've captured all the requirements that stakeholders yourselves identify as a priority, and if they meet your needs, and if not, if we're missing anything, to please let us know. So just go to the next slide. So this is just a little bit about our focus areas for next steps. So yeah, as I mentioned, the product group is planning to reach out again to the focus group for feedback on the DNO gap analysis and get agreement with stakeholders on the priorities for the implementation plan. That implementation plan will be based between, I guess, starting. It'll be agreed, aims to be agreed by the end of this year, with delivery to start in 2022 and wrapping by the end of ED1. And then just a note on some of the kind of key areas that are of interest that are coming out of the product so far. So there's work to be done around open data and data sharing. So to be able to meet some stakeholder data needs that have been identified, it's going to involve making some data available that has historically been identified as commercially sensitive. So the product group is seeking further clarification on the feasibility of DNOs making this data available to stakeholders, while taking into consideration other work that's being done in that space. For example, Ofgem's energy data task force recommendations around the fact that data should be presumed open. So we just need to explore that a little bit more to see what we can do. The other note is a little bit around the impact of Ofgem's minded to position on access SCR, on what impact that has on product 9 work. So we have considered that, and at this time we don't believe that the outcome of the Access SCR should have a major impact on the P9 work, especially because we're considering the timescales for delivering the improved curtailment information as part of this product is looking to the end of ED1, whereas the impact of SCR will probably not start until ED2. But furthermore, the group does believe that the overall benefit of improving access to network data remains kind of irrespective of what happens with the Access SCR. So just another consultation question around this is if you agree with our focus areas for next steps, and if not, to more than happy to receive any other alternative proposals. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Harriet. That was a really useful summary of the work that the product team have done, and some really good open questions about asking our stakeholders what they think they would like us to do next. So that's brilliant. Thank you. And the last presentation of this afternoon's session, I'm going to introduce Matt, who is picking up product 6 and is going to talk to us about non-DSO services. So over to you, Matt.
Hi there, not too many Matthews today. I'm Matthew Hamilton. I'm a project manager at SSEN, and I'm also the lead for product 6, which is market facilitation for non-DSO services. And I'll be talking about what product 6 has been up to this year. So just to recap, the product's been looking into how DNOs can facilitate things like peer-to-peer trading of capacity, constraints, and energy in a neutral manner. So yep, already on the next slide. This year, Origami's led some market simulation workshops for product 6, which are focused on sharing and trading capacity and risk of curtailment that were intended to infer basic market rules for these non-DSO services. And we've been engaging with a variety of stakeholders to get as broad a range of input as possible. So the main aim of the workshops was to get stakeholder feedback on work carried out by the non-access SCR working group, who developed initial principles and rules that could be used to govern the trading and sharing of capacity. Next slide, please. So we held 4 workshops. Workshop 1 considered trading firm capacity, where users with excess firm capacity could commercialize it, and users with insufficient firm capacity could pay to increase demand or generation at their site. Workshop 2 considered tracing risk of curtailment, so that's non-firm capacity, where users with a low risk of curtailment could commercialize their position in the stack, and users with a high risk of curtailment could improve their position. We also had Workshop 3, which considered shared capacity, where a group of participants agreed to combine their firm capacity and non-firm capacity and create a collective shared capacity. And then finally, Workshop 4 considered the potential customer and network benefits, where participants reviewed the feedback from Workshops 1 and 3 and identified any potential barriers or benefits. So next slide, please. There was quite a lot of feedback from this actually, and I'm happy to share the report at the end of this presentation if you're interested, but just to fly through a high-level summary of the feedback we received. As you might expect, people are interested in trading and sharing capacity, but there's less interest in trading risk curtailment. Understandable, since you're investing in or paying for something that still has risk. There's a risk that there might be more sellers than buyers due to a huge variety of things that people might want to get rid of, but that might not meet other parties' specific requirements. Also, just a note there to say that you need to keep in mind other industry work, regulations and standards that might affect the attractiveness of trading and sharing capacity. And there was quite a bit of discussion around sensitivity factors, and by that I mean that generators or demand of different types connected at different distances to the substation will have different effects on the power flow, and these are often at the moment more of a rule of thumb and take some lengthy system studies. And then obviously the long lead time for system studies to confirm the trade is a major factor, and I think at the moment it's quite currently quite a resource intensive task, and that the timing is about 65 business days, which would definitely slow any future markets. So sort of onto some DNO implications. There was some concern raised as to whether DNO could or should be able to operate as a neutral market facilitator if they're also trading in the market under their role as a flexibility services buyer. Obviously, we're concerned what effect the trades have on the network, but our stakeholders were also concerned with what effect they have on third parties or existing or previous trades. And again, there was a lot of discussion around hoarding capacity and how the market rules need to be laid out to make sure everything's fair. DNOs aren't the trading capacity police, so we really need wider agreement on how this is governed. And then just some trading implications. There were some very strong feelings that it's none of the DNO's business what the cost value of the trades are. And again, unlocking more capacity would be an enabler for low carbon technologies. And there was a discussion around how this might even replace some A&M schemes, and standardising the peer-to-peer contracts involved in all of this would obviously really encourage market participation, as people would know what they're signing up for. Next slide, please. These are some of our considerations for future work or things that might impact future projects, and I've already touched on a lot of these points in the previous slide. So just to sum up the main ones, as I said, system study requirements need to be streamlined if we're going to facilitate more trades in a shorter time frame. Sensitivity factors, so the physical effects and implications of the trades, need to be better understood and explained. In general, there needs to be more work carried out and detail provided in a transparent way on the rules of trading, how the markets will operate, and obviously what the standards are. Also onto appetite, we can debate the theory of this as much as we want, but if nobody actually wants these services, then all of this work might be wasted. So we need to make sure it's appealing and understood. And just to say that all of these changes will obviously need to be implemented in the DNOs gradually, as we might not fully understand what their impacts are on other services. So next slide, please. Our next steps have been informed by stakeholder feedback from the market simulation workshops and wider consultations and steer within open networks. Basically, our plan is to postpone product 6 until the second half of 2022 to wait for learning to become available from some larger and much better resourced projects in the area. We don't want to reinvent the wheel, so we're aiming to use this learning as a jumping off point for a sort of gap analysis and a more detailed product scope for 2023. But just to summarise the current state of play, so we originally planned to progress live trials around trading firm capacity with Project Transition and Leo, but they've got a pretty tight scope. So instead we've been invited on as reviewing stakeholders to help steer their existing trials, and that way we'll be right up to date with the learning from that. There wasn't much appetite in our workshops around trading risk of curtailment right now, but there's a few other projects and products within open networks looking into maturing this as a topic, like Trader as well as an NIA project. So again, we're really just looking to wait for their learning outcomes, and exploring shared capacity is also an option going forward. And we've been speaking about this, but we've been advised that it's currently sort of a lower priority topic, at least for next year's Workstream 1A. And I didn't write down any specific questions, but again, we would welcome feedback on any of our workshop findings. So let us know if you want the report. Our main question off the back of that and this presentation is really looking to gauge interest or appetite around these 3 topics. We know there's a fair amount of interest in trading firm capacity, but how interested are you in trading risk of curtailment or pursuing shared capacity agreements? And that's everything from me. So cheers, thanks very much.
Great, thank you very much, Matt. Really interesting piece of work, and lots of things potentially that are going to come DNO's ways in the future, or DSO ways in the future. So I'm going to now ask all of the speakers to prepare themselves, and I'm going to hand over to Avi and Emily to see whether we've had any additional questions. And we also ask people to put their hands up as well if they'd like to ask a question to any of the panel members or any of the speakers, because we've covered in today's session, or we've had presentations from all but 2 of the products. Product 1 and product 4, we have people who can answer questions on the panel for those 2 products. So feel free to either direct your questions related to the topics that we've talked about this afternoon, or any of the topics that are raised in the consultation. So I'll hand over to you, Emily and Avi, and do you want to take us away with any questions that you've recorded?
Yeah, absolutely. So we had a question earlier from Rob Harper that we thought would be best to raise in the broader Q&A. There is considerable discussion on the opportunity that vehicle to grid and or local storage will aid network balancing and demand side management. Where and how do the group see this market developing? What barriers exist given the concerns raised by some of the products shared on this seminar?
Okay, great. Any of the product leads would like to start the discussion or start the answer to the question? Right, Sven's put his hand up, so we'll start with you, Sven.
I think quite simply, we would expect to be able to procure flexibility services through aggregators, just as we do now. So with these new technologies offering new methods of providing that control, I don't think that the mechanism would look any different. Certainly from a DNO perspective, we'd still be procuring from an aggregator or demand side response service provider, these new technologies simply being further items in their portfolios.
Excellent, thank you. Any of the other speakers like to comment?
Yeah, I guess it was one of the concerns that was raised in the baseline in product is around how we accommodate emerging technologies, EVs and battery storage being an example. And I guess the only thing that we can really say really at the moment around that is that we're obviously trialing those types of technologies through our innovation programs. There's several innovation products that are looking at trialing different technologies and how they can respond to flexibility. But yeah, until we've got, you know, the examples and the volumes that we can take that experience from and work with aggregators or operators of those types of assets, we don't have all the answers right now for some of those complexities around how we baseline so it's different assets and different response types. But yeah, it's definitely work in progress and work we're looking to resolve in collaboration with you know, stakeholders and owner operators of those types of technologies.
Okay, great. Thanks, Helen. Again, I'll open it up to see whether any of the other speakers would like to make a comment. Okay, let's assume silence is golden. And Emily, do you want to move to the next question?
We don't have any other questions lined up, so just a reminder, if people would like to ask, feel free to raise your hand. And if not, we can move to our wrap up.
Okay. We'll just pause for a moment to see if anyone would like to raise the hand or put a question in the chat.
It looks like everyone is happy to proceed. Okay,
let's move to the wrap up then. So I think it falls to me to say thank you very much to all of the speakers. As I said, we have covered and provided an update on all but 2 of the products that we have in Workstream 1A, the flexibility workstream, and you can see we are doing a massive piece of work under the Open Networks project. We clearly need your guidance and support on the questions that we've raised. There are 20 questions in the consultation paper, 3 broad questions right at the beginning, and then 17 specific questions about the various products. We'd welcome any comments that anyone's had or anyone has. We are really looking for some input and some guidance, particularly on some of the next steps that were raised in the presentations earlier in the webinar. There is a reminder that we are holding another webinar on the 8th of September, and the details are on the screen. And then just a final reminder that the consultation closes on the 24th of September. If you could provide those comments or responses to our questions via the email address on the screen. All this information is, of course, embedded in the consultation paper. And on our plan really is to try and respond to all of the comments, all of the answers that are given by the end of October. So to review and respond to your comments on the consultation and we will publish that hopefully on the ENA's website by the end of October. And all I can say now is thank you very much for listening. There is a massive piece of work under 1A, and we are looking for help, support and guidance on the progress that we've made to date, and in particular about where we are planning to go next with our flexibility workstream. So please have a read of our consultation and send us in your comments. So, oh, and a final bit really. So I suspect Emily will in the next few days share the recording and the materials associated with all of the products that we talk through today. These are all hyperlinks, so you'll receive all of this information probably in the next few coming days. It gives you an opportunity to find straight away where all the materials that we've covered in the webinar this afternoon. And just say thank you very much for everyone for participating. I found it immensely interesting, and it shows that we are making great strides in Great Britain on the development of flexibility. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thanks all. Bye.